Hello everyone, and a warm welcome to BookWaves. It's wonderful to have all you fellow book lovers here. Today, we open the first page of a truly special novel, Cranford, a timeless and affectionate legacy left to us by the brilliant author Elizabeth Gaskell. First, a little about the author herself. Elizabeth Gaskell was a celebrated novelist of the Victorian era in Great Britain, renowned for her sharp social commentary and deeply humane portrayal of women's lives. While many know her for powerful novels like North and South, this work, Cranford, reveals her remarkable talent for warmth and witty observation. But here is a fascinating fact you might not know. The town of Cranford is not entirely a work of fiction. It is based on the real English town of Knutsford, where Gaskell spent her childhood. The Society of Ladies, their particular rules, and their memorable stories were inspired by the real people she grew up with. Knowing this, we are truly looking through a window into a real, lost world. It is a true honor to present Cranford to you as an audiobook. In this first video, we will cover the story from Chapter 1 to Chapter 2. We are about to step into a community ruled by strong-willed women, where gentility is everything, and poverty is a word never to be spoken. But what happens when a kind, but shockingly blunt, new resident arrives, and how does his presence lead to an unforgettable town tragedy that no one saw coming? As you listen, please feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments below, and be sure to check the description box for a preview of our next episode. Thank you so much for being here. Now, let's quietly begin our story in Cranford. Chapter 1. To begin, the town of Cranford was in the possession of the Amazons. The holders of all houses above a certain rent were women. If a married couple ever came to settle there, the gentleman would somehow disappear. He might have been frightened to death by being the only man at the evening parties, or perhaps he was accounted for by his duties, with his regiment, his ship, or his business. He would be occupied all week in the great commercial town of Drumble, which was only 20 miles away by railroad. In short, whatever became of the gentlemen, they were simply not in Cranford. And what could they possibly do if they were there? The surgeon had his 30-mile route and slept in the town, but not every man could be a surgeon. The ladies of Cranford were entirely sufficient for all the needs of the community. They kept the gardens perfectly trim, filled with choice flowers and without a single weed to be seen. They were quick to frighten away the little boys who stared wistfully at those flowers through the railings. They would rush out at any geese that occasionally ventured into the gardens if the gates were left open. The ladies decided all questions of literature and politics without bothering with unnecessary reasons or arguments. They kept a clear and correct knowledge of everyone's affairs in the parish. They also kept their neat maidservants in admirable order. They showed kindness to the poor, even if it was somewhat dictatorial. And they offered real, tender services to each other whenever they were in distress. As one of them once remarked to me, a man is truly just in the way inside a house. The Cranford ladies only had an occasional, small quarrel. It was usually expressed in a few peppery words and some angry jerks of the head. This was just enough to prevent the steady rhythm of their lives from becoming too flat. Their manner of dress was very independent of fashion, As they often observed, what did it matter how they dressed in Cranford, where everybody already knew them? And if they traveled away from home, their reasoning was equally convincing. What did it matter how they dressed in a place where nobody knew them at all? The materials of their clothes were generally of good quality and simple design. Most of them were nearly as scrupulous about cleanliness as the late Miss Tyler was known to be. And I can personally attest that the very last gigot sleeve and the very last tight and scanty petticoat worn in England was seen in Cranford, and it was seen without anyone even smiling. I can also testify to a magnificent family heirloom, a red silk umbrella. Under its shelter, a gentle little spinster, the last survivor of many brothers and sisters, used to patter to church on rainy days. I often wonder if they have red silk umbrellas in London. We had a local story about the first one that had ever been seen in our town. The little boys had surrounded it and given it a nickname, a stick in petticoats. I imagine it might have been the very same one I described. It was once held by a strong father, protecting his large family of little ones. Now, the poor lady, the sole survivor, could scarcely carry it herself. Then, there were the strict rules and regulations for visiting and for calls. These rules were announced to any young people who might be staying in the town. They were delivered with all the solemnity of the old Manx laws being read once a year on the tin-walled mount. A friend might send a message, inquiring how a young lady was feeling after her 15-mile journey in a carriage. They would assure her some rest for the next day. But on the day after that, they would certainly call. Therefore, she was told to be at liberty after 12, because the hours from 12 to 3 were the official calling hours. After a call had been made, another set of rules came into play. A young lady would be reminded by her hostess that a return call must never be delayed by more than 3 days. It was a lesson her mother had surely taught her. Furthermore, she was instructed never to stay longer than a quarter of an hour. I once asked how one could possibly know when the time was up without the rudeness of looking at a watch. The advice was simple. One must simply keep thinking about the time and never allow the conversation to become so absorbing as to forget it. Since everyone, whether visitor or hostess, held this rule firmly in their minds, no deep subject was ever discussed. We confined ourselves to short, simple sentences of small talk. And we were always punctual. I came to imagine that a few of the gentlefolk in Cranford were poor and had some difficulty in making ends meet. But if they were like the Spartans, concealing their hardship behind a smiling face. We never spoke of money. That subject felt too much like commerce and trade. And though some of us might have been poor, we were all aristocratic. The Cranfordians possessed a kindly corporate spirit which made them overlook all deficiencies in success when one of their own tried to conceal her poverty. For instance, when Mrs. Forrester gave a party in her tiny baby house of a home, a curious scene unfolded. The little maid would interrupt the ladies on the sofa with a request to retrieve the tea tray from underneath it. Everyone took this novel, proceeding as the most natural thing in the world. We would all carry on talking about household forms and ceremonies, as if we truly believed our hostess had a regular servants' hall and a full staff, instead of the one little charity school maiden. Her short, ruddy arms could never have been strong enough to carry the tray upstairs if she had not been assisted in private by her mistress. And that same mistress now sat in state, pretending not to know what cakes were sent up. Yet she knew, and we knew, and she knew that we knew, and we knew that she knew that we knew, that she had been busy all the morning making tea bread and sponge cakes with her own hands. This general but unacknowledged poverty, paired with a very much acknowledged gentility, had a few consequences that were not at all unpleasant. Indeed, they could be introduced into many other social circles to their great improvement. For one, the inhabitants of Cranford kept early hours. They clattered home in their pattens under the guidance of a lantern-bearer at about 9 o'clock at night. The whole town was abed and asleep by 10:30. Moreover, it was considered vulgar, a truly tremendous word in Cranford, to give anything expensive in the way of food or drink at the evening entertainments. Wafer, bread and butter, and sponge biscuits were all that the Honorable Mrs. Jamieson ever gave. And she, the sister-in-law to the late Earl of Glenmire, practiced this elegant economy with pride. I found myself falling back into the phraseology of the town, using the term they referred to as an elegant economy. In Cranford, economy was always considered elegant, while spending money was seen as vulgar and ostentatious. It was a philosophy of pretending to dislike what one cannot have, and this mindset kept us all very peaceful and satisfied. I will never forget the dismay that rippled through the town when a certain Captain Brown arrived. He spoke openly of his poverty. It was not done in a whisper to a close friend behind closed doors, but right in the public street in a loud military voice. He even cited his poverty as the reason for not taking a particular house. The ladies were already moaning over the invasion of their territory by a man. He was a captain on half pay, connected to the neighboring railroad that the town had so vehemently petitioned against. And now, on top of his gender and his ties to that obnoxious railroad, he was brazen enough to speak of being poor. It was decided that such a man must be sent to Coventry. Poverty, like death, was a true and common thing, yet no one ever spoke of it aloud in the streets. It was a word not meant for polite ears. We had all tacitly agreed to ignore that poverty could ever prevent our equals from doing as they wished. If we walked to a party, it was because the night was fine and the air refreshing, not because sedan chairs were expensive. If we wore simple prints instead of summer silks, it was because we preferred a material that could be washed. We continued in this way until we had blinded ourselves to the vulgar fact that we were all people of very moderate means. It was no surprise, then, that we did not know what to make of a man who spoke of poverty as if it were no disgrace. Yet, somehow, Captain Brown earned their respect. He was called upon, in spite of all resolutions to the contrary. I was surprised, on a visit about a year after he had settled there, to hear his opinions quoted as authority. My own friends, who had once been the most bitter opponents of visiting the captain and his daughters, now accepted him. He was even admitted during the tabooed hours before noon. True, it was only to investigate a smoking chimney before the fire was lit, but still, Captain Brown walked upstairs, undaunted. He spoke in a voice too large for the room and joked like a man who was perfectly at ease in the house. He had been entirely blind to the small slights and the omission of trivial ceremonies that had met his arrival. He remained friendly, even when the Cranford ladies were cool. He answered their small, sarcastic compliments with simple good faith. His manly frankness simply overpowered the shrinking hesitation that greeted him as a man unashamed of his poverty. In the end, his excellent masculine common sense and his knack for solving domestic dilemmas had earned him an extraordinary place of authority among the ladies of Cranford. He continued on his way, just as unaware of his new popularity as he had been of their initial disapproval. I am sure he was quite startled one day when he discovered that a piece of advice he had given in jest was being taken in sober, serious earnest. This very advice was given on the subject of an old lady and her Alderney cow. She looked upon the animal as a daughter. One could not pay the short quarter-hour call without being told of the creature's wonderful milk or its remarkable intelligence. The entire town knew and kindly regarded Miss Betsy Barker's Alderney. Therefore, there was great sympathy and regret when, in an unguarded moment, the poor cow tumbled into a lime pit. It moaned so loudly that it was quickly heard and rescued. But in the process, the poor beast lost most of its hair. It came out looking naked, cold, and utterly miserable in its bare skin. Everybody pitied the animal, though a few could not restrain their smiles at its droll appearance. Miss Betsy Barker herself absolutely cried with sorrow and dismay. It was said she even considered trying a bath of oil. This remedy might have been recommended by someone she consulted, but the proposal was thoroughly dismissed by Captain Brown's decided opinion. He advised her to get the animal a flannel waistcoat and flannel drawers if she wished to keep it alive. Then he added that his ultimate advice was to simply kill the poor creature at once. Miss Betsy Barker dried her eyes and thanked the captain heartily. She set to work, and soon the whole town turned out to see the spectacle. The Alderney cow, meekly making its way to pasture, was now fully clad in dark gray flannel. I have watched her myself many a time. I often wonder if one ever sees cows dressed in gray flannel in London. Captain Brown had taken a small house on the outskirts of town, where he lived with his 2 daughters. He must have been upwards of 60 at the time of my first visit to Cranford after I had ceased to live there. But he had a wiry, well-trained figure and an elastic, springing step. With the stiff military set of his head, he appeared much younger than he was. His eldest daughter, however, looked nearly as old as he did, betraying his true age. Miss Brown must have been 40. She wore a sickly, pained, and careworn expression, as if the gaiety of youth had long since faded from her sight. Even in her younger days, she must have been plain and hard-featured. Her sister, Miss Jessie Brown, was 10 years younger and 20 shades prettier. Her face was round and dimpled. I recall Miss Jenkins once declaring, in a fit of passion against the captain, that she felt it was time for Miss Jessie to leave off her dimples and not always try to look like a child. There was, in truth, something very childlike in her face. I suspect there always will be, even if she lives to be 100. Her eyes were large, blue, and wondering, and they looked straight at you. Her nose was rather unformed and snub, and her lips were red and dewy. She wore her hair in little rows of curls, which only heightened this youthful appearance. I never decided if she was pretty or not, but I liked her face, as did everyone else. And I do not think she could help her dimples. She had a touch of her father's jaunty manner, and a keen female observer might have noticed a slight difference in the sisters' attire. Miss Jessie's was more expensive than Miss Brown's by about £2 a year. In Captain Brown's annual budget, £2 was a very large sum. Such was the impression the Brown family made upon me when I first saw them all together in Cranford Church. I had met the captain once before on the occasion of the smoky chimney, which he had cured with a simple alteration in the flue. In church, he held his double eyeglass to his eyes during the morning hymn, then lifted his head high and sang out, loud and joyful. His responses were louder than those of the clerk, an old man with a piping, feeble voice. I believe the old clerk felt quite aggrieved by the captain's sonorous bass, and his own voice quivered higher and higher in consequence. On leaving the church, the brisk captain paid the most gallant attention to his two daughters. He nodded and smiled at his acquaintances, but he shook hands with no one until he had helped Miss Brown to unfurl her umbrella. He relieved her of her prayer book and waited patiently as her trembling, nervous hands gathered up her gown for the walk through the wet roads. I found myself wondering how the Cranford ladies would manage Captain Brown at their parties. In former days, we had often rejoiced that there were no gentlemen to attend to or find conversation for at the card parties. We had congratulated ourselves on the snugness of our evenings. In our love for gentility and our distaste for mankind, we had almost persuaded ourselves that to be a man was to be something vulgar. So when my friend and hostess, Miss Jenkins, announced she was having a party in my honor and that the captain and his daughters were invited, I wondered much what the course of the evening would be. Card tables with their green baize tops were set out by daylight, just as usual. It was the third week in November, so the evenings closed in around 4 o'clock. Candles and clean packs of cards were arranged on each table. The fire was made up, and the neat maidservant had received her final directions. There we all stood, dressed in our best, a candle lighter in each hand, ready to dart at the wicks as soon as the first knock came. Parties in Cranford were solemn festivities. They made the ladies feel gravely elated as they sat together in their finery. As soon as 3 guests had arrived, we sat for a game of preference, with me as the unlucky 4th. The next 4 arrivals were immediately put down to another table. Presently, the tea trays were brought in. I had seen them set out in the storeroom that morning, and now they were placed in the middle of each card table. The china was a delicate eggshell, and the old-fashioned silver glittered from polishing, but the eatables were of the very slightest description. It was while the trays were still on the tables that Captain Brown and his daughters came in. I could see at once that, somehow, the captain was a favorite with all the ladies present. Ruffled brows were smoothed and sharp voices were lowered at his approach. Miss Brown looked ill and seemed depressed almost to the point of gloom. Miss Jessie smiled, as she always did, and appeared nearly as popular as her father. He immediately and quietly assumed the man's place in the room. He attended to everyone's wants. He lessened the pretty maidservant's labor by waiting on ladies with empty cups or those in need of bread and butter. He did it all in such an easy and dignified manner, as if it were simply a matter of course for the strong to attend to the weak. He was a true gentleman throughout. He played for 3-penny points with as grave an interest as if they had been pounds. Yet, in all his attention to the other guests, he always kept an eye on his suffering daughter. For I was sure she was suffering, though to many she might only have appeared irritable. Miss Jessie could not play cards, but she talked to those who sat out and who, before her arrival, had been rather inclined to be cross. She also sang, accompanied by an old cracked piano that I believe had been a spinet in its youth. She sang a song called Jock of Hazeldean, a little out of tune. But none of us were musical, though Miss Jenkins beat time, completely out of time, by way of appearing to be so. It was truly very good of Miss Jenkins to do this. I had seen, only a little earlier, that she had been quite annoyed by Miss Jessie Brown's unguarded admission. Speaking of Shetland wool, Miss Jessie had mentioned that her uncle, her mother's brother, was a shopkeeper in Edinburgh. Miss Jenkins tried to drown this confession with a terrible cough. The Honorable Mrs. Jameson was sitting at the nearest card table, and what would she think to find herself in the same room as a shopkeeper's niece? But Miss Jessie, who had no tact, as we all agreed the next morning, simply repeated the information. She assured Miss Pole she could easily get the required wool through her uncle, who had the best assortment of Shetland goods in all of Edinburgh. It was to wash the taste of this vulgarity from our mouths and its sound from our ears that Miss Jenkins had proposed music. So I say again, it was very good of her indeed to beat time to the song. When the trays reappeared with biscuits and wine, punctually at 9:15, there was a buzz of conversation, a comparing of cards, and a talking over of tricks. But by and by, Captain Brown introduced a bit of literature. He asked if anyone had seen the recent numbers of the Pickwick papers, which were being published in parts at the time. He declared them to be a capital thing. Now Miss Jenkins was the daughter of the deceased rector of Cranford. On the strength of his many manuscript sermons and a fine library of divinity, she considered herself literary. She looked upon any conversation about books as a personal challenge. So she replied that, yes, she had seen them. Indeed, she might even say she had read them. The captain exclaimed, asking what she thought of them, and were they not famously good? Being so urged, Miss Jenkins could not but speak her mind. She stated that she did not by any means consider them equal to the work of Dr. Johnson. Still, she allowed, perhaps the author was young. If he would only persevere and take the great doctor for his model, who knew what he might become? This was evidently too much for Captain Brown to take placidly. I saw the words forming on the tip of his tongue even before Miss Jenkins had finished. He began by explaining that it was quite a different sort of thing. Miss Jenkins returned that she was quite aware of that, and that she was making allowances. The captain then pleaded with her, asking to be allowed to read a scene from that month's number. He had only received it that morning, he explained, and he was sure the company had not yet had the chance to read it. Miss Jenkins settled herself with an air of resignation, telling him to do as he pleased. The captain then read the account of the soiree which Sam Weller gave at Bath. Some of the guests laughed heartily. I did not dare to join them, being a guest in the house. Miss Jenkins herself sat in patient gravity. When he had finished, she turned to me. With a mild dignity, she requested that I fetch her the book, Rasselas, from the bookroom. When I had brought it to her, she turned to Captain Brown. She proposed to read a scene of her own, so that the present company could judge between his favorite, Mr. Boz, and her own Dr. Johnson. She then began to read one of the conversations between Rasselas and Imlac. Her voice was high-pitched and majestic. After she had ended, she declared that she imagined she was now justified in her preference of Dr. Johnson as a writer of fiction. The captain screwed his lips up and drummed his fingers on the table, but he did not speak. She, however, seemed intent on giving him a finishing blow or two. She stated that she considered it vulgar and beneath the dignity of literature to publish works in serial numbers. In a low voice, one I doubt Miss Jenkins heard, Captain Brown asked how The Rambler had been published. But she continued, proclaiming Dr. Johnson's style to be a model for young beginners. She explained that her own father had recommended it to her when she began writing letters and that she had formed her own style upon it. She finished by saying that she recommended it to the captain's favorite author. The captain replied that he would be very sorry for Mr. Boz to exchange his style for any such pompous writing. Miss Jenkins felt this as a personal affront in a way the captain could not have dreamed. Epistolary writing was what she and her friends considered her specialty. I had seen many a copy of her letters, written and corrected on a slate, before she would seize the half hour just before post time to send them, and Dr. Johnson was, as she had said, her model. She drew herself up with great dignity. She replied to the captain's last remark only by stating, with marked emphasis on every syllable, that she preferred Dr. Johnson to Mr. Boz. It was said, though I cannot vouch for the fact, that Captain Brown was heard to mutter a curse upon Dr. Johnson under his breath. If he did, he was certainly penitent afterwards. He showed this by going to stand near Miss Jenkins's armchair, endeavoring to draw her into conversation on some more pleasing subject, but she was inexorable. And it was the very next day that she made that sharp remark I mentioned earlier about Miss Jessie's dimples. Chapter 2. It was impossible to live for a month in Cranford and not know the daily habits of each resident. Long before my visit was over, I knew a great deal about the entire Brown trio. There was nothing new to discover about their poverty, for they had spoken of it simply and openly from the very beginning. They made no mystery of the need for their economy. All that remained to be discovered was the captain's infinite kindness of heart and the many ways in which he showed it, often unconsciously. Little anecdotes about him were talked about for some time after they occurred. Since we did not read much, and all the ladies were well suited with servants, there was a general shortage of topics for conversation. We therefore found ourselves discussing the time the captain took a poor old woman's dinner right out of her hands one very slippery Sunday. He had met her returning from the bakehouse as he came from church and had noticed her precarious footing. With the grave dignity that marked all his actions, he relieved her of her burden. He then steered her along the street by her side, carrying her baked mutton and potatoes safely home. This act was considered very eccentric. It was rather expected that he would pay a round of calls on Monday morning to explain and apologize to the Cranford sense of propriety, but he did no such thing. And so it was decided that he must be ashamed and was keeping out of sight. In a kindly pity for him, we began to remark that, after all, the Sunday morning's occurrence had shown great goodness of heart. It was resolved that he should be comforted on his next appearance. But then he came down upon us, completely untouched by any sense of shame. He spoke as loud and deep as ever, his head thrown back, his wig as jaunty and well curled as usual. We were obliged to conclude that he had forgotten all about Sunday. Miss Pole and Miss Jessie Brown had formed a kind of intimacy built upon a shared interest in Shetland wool and new knitting stitches. It so happened that when I went to visit Miss Pole, I saw more of the Browns than I had while staying with Miss Jenkins. My former hostess had never quite recovered from what she called Captain Brown's disparaging remarks upon Dr. Johnson as a writer of light fiction. During these visits, I discovered that the elder Miss Brown was seriously ill with some lingering, incurable complaint. It was the pain from this illness that gave the uneasy expression to her face, an expression I had mistaken for simple crossness. And cross she certainly was at times, when the nervous irritability from her disease became too much to endure. Miss Jessie bore with her sister during these episodes even more patiently than she bore the bitter self-upbraidings that invariably followed. Miss Brown would accuse herself not only of having a hasty temper, but also of being the reason her father and sister had to pinch and save to afford her the small luxuries that were necessities in her condition. She longed so deeply to make sacrifices for them and to lighten their cares that the natural generosity of her spirit actually added a sharpness to her temper. All of this was borne by Miss Jessie and her father with more than placidity. It was borne with absolute tenderness. It was when I saw her at home that I forgave Miss Jessie for singing out of tune and for the juvenility of her dress. I came to perceive that Captain Brown's dark Brutus wig and his padded coat, which was too often threadbare, were the last remnants of the military smartness of his youth, which he now wore without a second thought. He was a man of infinite resources, a skill gained from his experience in the barracks. He confessed once that no one could black his boots to his own satisfaction except himself. But he was not above saving the little maid, servant's labors in any way he could, knowing, most likely, that his daughter's illness made her position a very hard one. He endeavored to make peace with Miss Jenkins soon after the memorable dispute I have mentioned. Having overheard her say how much the grating of an iron fire shovel annoyed her, he presented her with a wooden one of his own making. She received the present with a cool gratitude and thanked him formally. But when he was gone, she instructed me to put it away in the lumber room. I suspect she felt that no present from a man who preferred Mr. Boz to Dr. Johnson could be any less jarring to her nerves than an iron fire shovel. Such was the state of things when I left Cranford and went to Drumble. I had, however, several correspondents who kept me informed of the proceedings in the dear little town. There was Miss Pole, who had become as absorbed in crochet as she once had been in knitting. The refrain of her letters was always a reminder to not forget the white worsted at Flint's. At the end of every sentence of news came a fresh direction for some crochet commission I was to carry out for her. Then there was Miss Matilda Jenkins, who did not mind being called Miss Mattie when her sister was not present. She wrote nice, kind, rambling letters, now and then venturing an opinion of her own. But she would suddenly pull herself up, either begging me not to repeat what she had said because Deborah thought differently, or adding a postscript. The postscript would explain that since writing she had discussed the matter with Deborah and was now quite convinced of the opposite, and then came Miss Jenkins herself. She preferred to be called Deborah by Miss Mattie, as their father had once said the Hebrew name ought to be pronounced that way. I secretly believed she took the Hebrew prophetess as her model of character. And indeed, making allowances for modern customs and dress, she was not unlike that stern figure. Miss Jenkins wore a cravat and a little bonnet like a jockey cap. She had the appearance of a strong-minded woman, though she would have despised the modern idea of women being equal to men. Equal, indeed. She knew they were superior. But to return to her letters, everything in them was as stately and grand as she was. I have been looking them over, and with great honor for her memory, I will share an extract. I choose it more especially because it relates to our friend Captain Brown. The letter began by explaining that the Honorable Mrs. Jameson had only just left her. In the course of their conversation, Mrs. Jameson had shared the news that she had received a call from her late husband's old friend, Lord Mauleverer. Miss Jenkins wrote that one could not easily guess what had brought his lordship to their little town. His purpose was to see Captain Brown. It appeared his lordship was acquainted with the captain from the days of what she termed the plumed wars. The captain had even had the privilege of saving his lordship's life during some great peril off the Cape of Good Hope. She noted Mrs. Jameson's well-known deficiency in the spirit of innocent curiosity, and thus was not surprised that Mrs. Jameson was unable to disclose the exact nature of the peril. Miss Jenkins confessed her own anxiety to learn how Captain Brown, with his limited means, could host such a distinguished guest. She soon discovered that his lordship slept at the Angel Hotel, enjoying, she hoped, refreshing slumbers. However, he shared his meals with the Browns during the 2 days he honored Cranford with his august presence. The butcher's wife had informed her that Miss Jessie purchased a leg of lamb, but beyond that, she could hear of no other preparations for such a visitor. Perhaps, she speculated, they entertained him with a feast of reason and a flow of soul. She added that for those of them acquainted with the captain's sad lack of taste for pure English literature, it must be a matter for congratulation. He had at last an opportunity to improve his taste by conversing with an elegant member of the aristocracy. She ended with a philosophical question, asking who, after all, is ever truly free from some mundane failing. Miss Pole and Miss Mattie wrote to me by the same post, as such a piece of news was not to be wasted by the letter-writers of Cranford. They made the most of it. Miss Mattie humbly apologized for writing at the same time as her sister, who was far more capable of describing the honor done to the town. But despite a little bad spelling, it was Miss Mattie's account that gave me the best sense of the actual commotion. From her letter, I gathered that Lord Mauleverer had hardly spoken to anyone at all, with a few exceptions. These included the people at the inn, the Browns, Mrs. Jameson, and a little boy his lordship had sworn at for driving a dirty hoop against his aristocratic legs. My next visit to Cranford was in the summer. There had been no births, deaths, or marriages since I was last there. Everybody lived in the same house and wore pretty nearly the same well-preserved, old-fashioned clothes. The greatest event was that Miss Jenkins had purchased a new carpet for the drawing room. Oh, what busy work Miss Mattie and I had in chasing the sunbeams as they fell in an afternoon right down on that carpet. We would spread newspapers over the sunlit spots and sit down to our work. But in a quarter of an hour, the sun would have moved, blazing away on a fresh patch of carpet, and down we would go again on our knees to alter the position of the newspapers. We were also very busy one whole morning before a party following Miss Jenkins's directions. We cut and stitched together pieces of newspaper, forming little paths to every chair set for the visitors, lest their shoes should dirty or defile the purity of the carpet. I often wonder, do they make paper paths for every guest to walk upon in London? Captain Brown and Miss Jenkins were not very cordial to each other. The literary dispute, of which I had seen the beginning, was a raw wound, and the slightest touch on it made them wince. It was their only difference of opinion, but that difference was enough. Miss Jenkins could not refrain from talking at Captain Brown. And though he did not reply, he would drum his fingers, an action she felt and resented as deeply disparaging to Dr. Johnson. The captain, for his part, was rather ostentatious in his preference for the writings of Mr. Boz. He would walk through the streets so absorbed in them that he once nearly ran into Miss Jenkins. And though his apologies were earnest and sincere, and though he did no more than startle them both, she later owned to me a strange thought. She would have rather he had knocked her down, if only he had been reading a higher style of literature. The poor, brave captain. He looked older and more worn, and his clothes were very threadbare. But he seemed as bright and cheerful as ever, unless he was asked about his daughter's health. When the subject arose, he would explain that she suffered a great deal and was destined to suffer more. He would say that they did all they could to alleviate her pain, and that God's will must be done, always taking off his hat as he spoke the final words. I found out from Miss Mattie that everything possible had, in fact, been done. A medical man of high repute had been sent for, and every one of his instructions was followed, regardless of expense. Miss Mattie was sure they denied themselves many things to make the invalid comfortable, but they never spoke of it, and as for Miss Jessie, Miss Mattie would become quite overcome with emotion. She told me she truly thought Jessie was an angel. She described how beautifully Jessie bore her sister's crossness, and the bright face she put on after sitting up all night, being scolded for half of it. Yet she always looked as neat and as ready to welcome the captain at breakfast as if she had slept in the Queen's bed. Miss Mattie insisted that I could never again laugh at Jessie's prim little curls or her pink bows, if only I could have seen her as she had done. I could only feel very penitent, and so I greeted Miss Jessie with double respect when I next met her. She looked faded and pinched. Her lips began to quiver as if from weakness when she spoke of her sister. But then she would brighten and push back the tears glittering in her pretty eyes. She would marvel at what a town Cranford was for kindness. She supposed that no one had a better dinner than usual cooked, but that the best part of it always came to her sister in a little covered basin. The poor people would leave their earliest vegetables at their door for her. They spoke in short, gruff sentences, as if ashamed of their own kindness, but she confessed it often went to her heart to see their thoughtfulness. The tears would then come back and overflow. After a minute, however, she would begin to scold herself and end by going away, the same cheerful Miss Jessie as ever. I later asked Miss Mattie why this Lord Maulevrier did not do something for the man who had saved his life. She explained that Captain Brown, unless he had some specific reason, never spoke of being poor. He had walked alongside his lordship looking as happy and cheerful as a prince. Since they never called attention to their humble dinners with apologies, and as Miss Brown had been feeling better that day, everything seemed bright. She surmised his lordship never knew how much care there was in the background. He did send them game quite often in the winter, but he had since gone abroad. I had often occasion to notice the use that was made of fragments and small opportunities in Cranford. Rose leaves were gathered before they fell, to be made into potpourri for someone who had no garden. Little bundles of lavender flowers were sent to strew the drawers of a town dweller or to burn in the chamber of an invalid. Things that many would despise, and actions that seemed scarcely worth performing, were all attended to in Cranford. Miss Jenkins stuck an apple full of cloves to be heated so it would smell pleasantly in Miss Brown's room. As she put in each clove, she would utter a Johnsonian sentence. Indeed, she could never think of the Browns without talking of Dr. Johnson, and as they were seldom absent from her thoughts at that time, I heard many a rolling three-piled sentence. Captain Brown called one day to thank Miss Jenkins for many little kindnesses which, until then, I did not know she had rendered. He had suddenly become like an old man. His deep bass voice had a quaver in it, his eyes looked dim, and the lines on his face were deep. He did not, and could not, speak cheerfully of his daughter's state. He talked instead with a manly, pious resignation, and did not say much. Twice over he repeated that God only knew what Jessie had been to them. And after the second time he got up hastily, shook hands all round without speaking, and left the room. That afternoon, we perceived little groups of people in the street, all listening with aghast faces to some terrible story. Miss Jenkins wondered for some time what could be the matter before she took the undignified step of sending Jenny out to inquire. Jenny came back, her face white with terror. She burst into tears as she delivered the awful news. She cried out to her mistress that Captain Brown had been killed by those nasty, cruel railroads. She, along with many others, had known the poor captain's kindness. Miss Jenkins urged her to stop wasting time in crying and tell them something. But it was Miss Mattie who rushed out into the street at once and collared the man who was telling the tale. She cried out, begging the man to come in, to come to her sister, the rector's daughter. She pleaded with him, asking him to say it was not true. She said all this as she brought the affrighted Carter, who was sleeking down his hair, into the drawing room. He stood there with his wet boots on the new carpet, and in that moment, no one regarded it. The man insisted that it was true, shuddering at the recollection. He had seen it himself. He explained that the captain had been deep in some new book, waiting for the down train. A little girl, wanting to get to her mother, had given her sister the slip and came toddling across the line. At the sound of the approaching train, the captain had looked up suddenly. He saw the child, darted onto the line, and caught her up. But his foot slipped, and the train came over him in no time. The carter cried out to the heavens, insisting it was all true, and that they had already gone to tell his daughters. He added that the child was safe, with only a bang on her shoulder from where he had thrown her to her mother. He was sure the poor captain would be glad of that. He ended with a blessing for the captain, then puckered up his manly face and turned away to hide his tears. I turned to Miss Jenkins. She looked very ill, as if she were going to faint, and she motioned for me to open the window. She then called for Matilda to bring her bonnet, stating with resolve that she must go to those girls. She prayed for God's pardon if ever she had spoken contemptuously to the captain. Miss Jenkins arrayed herself to go out, telling Miss Matilda to give the man a glass of wine. While she was away, Miss Mattie and I huddled over the fire, talking in a low and awestruck voice. "I know," we cried quietly the entire time. Miss Jenkins came home in a silent mood, and we dared not ask her many questions. She told us that Miss Jessie had fainted, and that she and Miss Pole had had some difficulty in bringing her round. As soon as she recovered, Jessie had begged one of them to go and sit with her sister. Shivering with feelings she dared not give way to, Jessie had explained that Mr. Hoggins believed her sister could not live many days, and that she must be spared this shock. Miss Jenkins had asked how she could possibly manage, for her sister would surely see her tears. Jessie had replied with faith that God would help her, and that she would not give way. Her sister was asleep when the news came, she explained, and might be asleep still. She would be so utterly miserable, not just at her father's death, but at the thought of what would become of her. Miss Pole later told Miss Jenkins that she could hardly bear hearing Jessie speak so, knowing how poorly her sister often treated her. However, it was settled according to Miss Jessie's wish. The elder Miss Brown was to be told her father had been summoned to take a short journey on railway business. They had managed it in some way, though Miss Jenkins could not say exactly how. Miss Pole was to stay with Miss Jessie. Mrs. Jameson had sent to inquire. This was all we heard that night, and it was a sorrowful night indeed. The next day, a full account of the fatal accident was in the county paper that Miss Jenkins subscribed to. She said her eyes were very weak and asked me to read it to her. When I came to the line describing the gallant gentleman as being deeply engaged in the perusal of a number of Pickwick, which he had just received, Miss Jenkins shook her head long and solemnly. Then she sighed, remarking what a poor, dear, infatuated man he was. The corpse was to be taken from the station to the parish church for burial. Miss Jessie had set her heart on following it to the grave, and no dissuasives could alter her resolve. Her restraint upon herself made her almost obstinate. She resisted all of Miss Pole's entreaties and Miss Jenkins's advice. At last, Miss Jenkins gave up the point. After a silence, which I feared might portend some deep displeasure, she announced that she herself would accompany Jessie to the funeral. She stated that it was not fit for Jessie to go alone. It would be against both propriety and humanity, she explained, were she to allow it. It seemed as if Miss Jessie did not half like this arrangement, but whatever obstinacy she had, it had been exhausted in her determination to go to the interment. I have no doubt the poor thing longed to cry alone over the grave of the dear father to whom she had been all in all. She wished to give way for one little half-hour, uninterrupted by sympathy and unobserved by friendship, but it was not to be. That afternoon, Miss Jenkins sent out for a yard of black crepe and busily trimmed the little black silk bonnet I have mentioned. When it was finished, she put it on and looked to us for approbation. Admiration she despised. I was full of sorrow, but a whimsical thought came unbidden into my head, as they often do in times of deepest grief. No sooner did I see the bonnet than I was reminded of a helmet. And in that hybrid bonnet, half helmet and half jockey cap, Miss Jenkins attended Captain Brown's funeral. I believe she supported Miss Jessie with a tender, indulgent firmness that was invaluable, allowing her to weep her passionate fill before they left. Miss Pole, Miss Mattie, and I, meanwhile, attended to Miss Brown. We found it hard work to relieve her querulous and never-ending complaints. But if we were so weary and dispirited, what must Miss Jessie have been? Yet she came back almost calm, as if she had gained a new strength. She put off her morning dress and came in, looking pale and gentle, thanking each of us with a soft, long pressure of the hand. She could even manage a faint, sweet, wintry smile, as if to reassure us of her power to endure. But her look made our eyes fill suddenly with tears, more than if she had cried outright. It was settled that Miss Pole was to remain with her all the watching livelong night. Miss Mattie and I were to return in the morning to relieve them and give Miss Jessie the opportunity for a few hours of sleep. But when the morning came, Miss Jenkins appeared at the breakfast table, equipped in her helmet bonnet. She ordered Miss Mattie to stay at home, as she herself meant to go and help to nurse. She was evidently in a state of great friendly excitement, which she showed by eating her breakfast standing and scolding the household all around. No nursing, no energetic, strong-minded woman could help Miss Brown now. There was a presence in the room as we entered which was stronger than us all, and made us shrink into solemn, awestruck helplessness. Miss Brown was dying. We hardly knew her voice. It was so devoid of the complaining tone we had always associated with it. Miss Jessie told me afterwards that her voice and her face, too, were just what they had been formerly, when their mother's death had left her the young, anxious head of the family. The dying woman was conscious of her sister's presence, though I do not think she was aware of ours. We stood a little behind the curtain. Miss Jessie knelt with her face near her sister's in order to catch the last, soft, awful whispers. The dying woman breathed her sister's name, confessing with anguish how selfish she had been. She begged God to forgive her for letting Jessie sacrifice herself so completely, professing her deep love while admitting she had only ever thought of herself. Jessie, sobbing, tried to hush her with words of love, but her sister's thoughts had turned to their dear, dear father. She lamented that she would not complain now, if only God would grant her the strength to be patient. She expressed a deep yearning to see him one last time, to ask for his forgiveness, grieving that he could never know how she had loved him. What a life of sorrow his had been, and she had done so little to cheer him. A light came into Miss Jessie's face. She asked her sister if it would bring her comfort to think that their father did, in fact, know of her love. Her voice quivered, but she steadied it into calmness as she leaned closer. She called her sister Mary and told her that he had gone before her to the place where the weary are at rest. He knew now, she assured her, how much she had loved him. A strange look, which was not of distress, came over Miss Brown's face. She was silent for some time. Then we saw her lips form the names of her departed family: father, mother, Harry, Archie. Then, as if a new thought cast a final shadow over her darkened mind, she added a last concern for her sister's coming loneliness. I believe Miss Jessie had been feeling this all along, for at these words, tears rolled down her cheeks like rain, and at first she could not answer. Then she put her hands together tightly, lifted them up, and spoke a vow not to us, but to the heavens. She declared that though he might slay her, yet she would still trust in him. In a few moments more, Miss Brown lay calm and still, her sorrows and murmurs over forever. After this second funeral, Miss Jenkins insisted that Miss Jessie should come to stay with her rather than go back to the desolate house. We learned from Miss Jessie that the house must now be given up, as she had no way to maintain it. She had little more than £20 a year, besides what the sale of the furniture might bring. She could not live upon that. So we talked over her qualifications for earning money. She suggested that she could sew neatly and that she liked nursing. She also thought she could manage a house as a housekeeper, or even work as a saleswoman in a shop, if they would have patience with her at first. Miss Jenkins declared in an angry voice that she should do no such thing. For nearly an hour afterwards, she was heard talking to herself about some people having no idea of their proper rank as a captain's daughter. This was just as she brought Miss Jessie a basin of delicately made arrowroot and stood over her like a dragoon until the last spoonful was finished. Then she disappeared. Miss Jessie began to tell me more of her plans, but soon fell into talking of days past and gone. She interested me so much that I took no heed of how the time passed. We were both startled when Miss Jenkins reappeared and caught us crying. I was afraid she would be displeased, as she often said that crying hindered digestion, and I knew she wanted Miss Jessie to get strong. But instead, she looked queer and excited, and fidgeted about without saying anything. At last, she spoke. She began in a flustered way, saying she had been so much startled. No, not startled at all. She told Miss Jessie not to mind her, but that she had been very much surprised. In fact, she had a caller, someone whom Miss Jessie had once known. At this, Miss Jessie went very white, then flushed scarlet, and looked eagerly at Miss Jenkins. The visitor, Miss Jenkins continued, was a gentleman who wanted to know if she would see him. Jessie stammered, unable to form a full question. Miss Jenkins simply handed her a card. And while Jessie's head was bent over it, Miss Jenkins went through a series of winks and made odd faces at me, forming her lips into a long, silent sentence which I could not understand a word of. At last, she asked if the gentleman might come up. With an air of resignation, as if to say it was Miss Jenkins' house to do with as she liked, Jessie agreed. She took up some of Miss Mattie's knitting and tried to look busy, though I could see how she trembled all over. Miss Jenkins rang the bell and told the servant who answered to show Major Gordon upstairs. Presently, a tall, fine, frank-looking man of 40 or upwards walked in. He shook hands with Miss Jessie, but he could not see her eyes, as she kept them fixed on the ground. Miss Jenkins then asked if I would come and help her tie up the preserves in the storeroom. Though Miss Jessie plucked at my gown and even looked up at me with begging eyes, I dared not refuse to go where Miss Jenkins asked. However, instead of tying up preserves, we went to talk in the dining room. There, Miss Jenkins told me all that Major Gordon had told her. She recounted how he had served in the same regiment with Captain Brown, and had become acquainted with Miss Jessie when she was a sweet, blooming girl of 18. The acquaintance had grown into love on his part, though it had been some years before he had spoken. After coming into a good estate in Scotland, he had offered and been refused, though with so much agitation and distress that he was sure she was not indifferent to him. He had discovered that the obstacle was the terrible disease that was even then threatening her sister. Jessie had mentioned that the surgeons foretold intense suffering, and there was no one but herself to nurse her poor Mary, or to comfort her father. They had had long discussions. And on her refusal to pledge herself to him as his wife when all should be over, he had grown angry, broken off the relationship entirely, and gone abroad. He had believed her to be a cold-hearted person whom he would do well to forget. He had been traveling in the East and was on his way home when, in Rome, he saw the account of Captain Brown's death in the Galignani newspaper. Just then, Miss Mattie, who had been out all morning, burst in. Her face was a picture of dismay and outraged propriety. She cried out to Deborah, exclaiming that there was a gentleman in the drawing-room with his arm around Miss Jessie's waist. Her eyes were large with terror. Miss Jenkins snubbed her down in an instant. She declared it was the most proper place in the world for his arm to be. She told Matilda to go away and mind her own business. This, coming from her sister, who had always been a model of feminine decorum, was a blow for poor Miss Mattie. With a double shock, she left the room. The last time I ever saw poor Miss Jenkins was many years after this. Mrs. Gordon had kept up a warm and affectionate intercourse with all at Cranford. Miss Jenkins, Miss Mattie, and Miss Pole had all been to visit her, and returned with wonderful accounts of her house, her husband, and her looks. With happiness, something of her early bloom had returned. She had been a year or two younger than we had taken her for. Her eyes were always lovely, and as Mrs. Gordon, her dimples were not out of place. At the time to which I have referred, when I last saw Miss Jenkins, that lady was old and feeble, and had lost something of her strong mind. Little Flora Gordon was staying with the Mrs. Jenkins. When I came in, she was reading aloud to Miss Jenkins, who lay feeble and changed on the sofa. Flora put down the book, The Rambler, when I entered. Miss Jenkins then spoke to me, remarking that I found her much changed, as she could no longer see as she used to. If Flora were not there to read to her, she hardly knew how she would get through the day. She asked if I had ever read The Rambler, calling it a wonderful book and the most improving reading for Flora. It would have been, I thought, if the child could have read half the words without spelling them. She then said it was better than that strange old book with the queer name, the one poor Captain Brown was killed for reading. She meant the book by Mr. Boz, but confused its name with Old Paws. She remembered that when she was a girl, a long time ago, she had acted the part of Lucy in a play of that name. She babbled on long enough for Flora to get a good long spell at a Christmas carol, which Miss Mattie had left on the table.